From the outside looking in, Thomas and Vanessa Reynolds had what many would call the perfect marriage. Living in a spacious home in Dallas, Texas, they were the epitome of stability and class. Thomas, a well-respected real estate broker, was known for his charisma and sharp business mind. Vanessa, his devoted wife of 20 years, carried herself with grace, her soft-spoken nature adding to her charm. The couple met in the early 2000s during one of Thomas's business trips to New Orleans. At the time, he was a rising star in the real estate market, and she was a mysterious yet captivating woman working at a small boutique hotel. Vanessa was unlike any woman he had ever met. Elegant, intelligent, and deeply private. There was something about her that intrigued Thomas. She had an air of mystery, an almost old-fashioned modesty that made her seem different from the women he had dated before. Within a few months, their whirlwind romance led to a proposal. Vanessa had no family present at their wedding. She explained that she was estranged from them, and Thomas, blinded by love, never questioned it. He adored her. She made him feel special, respected, and appreciated in a way no one else ever had. Their marriage was peaceful, structured, and built on what Thomas believed to be a strong foundation of trust. They hosted dinner parties, traveled together, and lived comfortably. Vanessa handled their home life with quiet efficiency, always making sure Thomas had a warm meal when he came home from work, always listening attentively when he spoke about his day. Yet, beneath the surface, there were things that Thomas chose to ignore. Vanessa had always been reserved about her past, never speaking much about her childhood or her life before they met. She avoided doctors, rarely socialized with other women, and had an unshakable reluctance toward intimacy. In the early years of their marriage, Thomas had questioned why she always hesitated when he initiated physical closeness. Her answer was simple. She had a traumatic past, one she wasn't ready to discuss. Over time, he stopped asking. He told himself that love was about trust, that some things were better left in the past. After all, they had built a life together. What did it matter if she held on to a few secrets? As their 20th anniversary approached, Thomas reflected on their years together with pride. They had lasted longer than most couples he knew. He assumed their love had stood the test of time. But what he didn't realize was that their marriage was built on a foundation of deception. One that was about to come crashing down in the most violent way possible. As their 20th wedding anniversary approached, Thomas noticed a shift in Vanessa's behavior. She seemed distant, distracted, and unusually tense. At first, he dismissed it as stress. Perhaps she was planning a surprise for their anniversary, he thought. But as the days passed, her unease became more pronounced. She had always been a private person, but now she was more guarded than ever. She would lock the bathroom door when she showered, something she had never done before. She became overly protective of her personal belongings, even taking her purse with her when she moved from room to room. One evening, Thomas came home from work earlier than usual and found Vanessa startled, clutching an envelope in her hands. Her face went pale when she saw him. "What's that?" he asked, stepping closer. Vanessa quickly shoved the envelope into a drawer. "Just some old paperwork," she said, forcing a smile. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Let me see." She hesitated for a moment too long. "It's nothing, Thomas," she insisted. "Why are you suddenly questioning everything?" Her defensive tone put him on edge. Vanessa had always been reserved, but never outright secretive. Something was wrong, and for the first time in their marriage, Thomas felt an unfamiliar sense of paranoia creeping in. That night, as Vanessa slept beside him, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed the small, odd moments over the years, the way she never talked about her childhood, the way she avoided deep intimacy, the fact that she had no close friends or family. How had he never questioned it before? The next morning, Thomas decided to do something he had never done in their 20 years together. He went through her personal things while she was out running errands. What he found would change everything. As soon as Vanessa left the house, Thomas wasted no time. His heart pounded as he made his way to their bedroom, a gnawing sense of dread creeping over him. He told himself he wasn't betraying her trust, he just needed answers. Something wasn't right, and his gut was screaming at him to find out what. He started with the drawer where she had hastily shoved the envelope the night before. His hands trembled as he pulled it out, unfolded the papers inside, and began to read. At first, it seemed like nothing, just old legal documents, birth records, and identification papers. But as he flipped through them, his eyes locked onto a name that sent a cold chill down his spine. Vincent Carter. His pulse quickened as he looked closer. The birth certificate in his hands did not belong to Vanessa Carter. It belonged to Vincent Carter, a male, born in Louisiana in 1974. His breath caught in his throat. His mind raced. This had to be a mistake. Vanessa was a woman. She had always been a woman. But as he continued rummaging through the papers, the horrifying truth became undeniable. There were medical documents detailing gender reassignment, surgery, old photos of a young man, tall with sharp features, who bore a striking resemblance to his wife. A legal name change certificate. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. His wife, the woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with, had been born a man. For 20 years, she had kept this from him. For 20 years, she had lied. A storm of emotions hit him at once. Shock, disgust, rage. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the dresser to steady himself. His mind screamed for an explanation, but the only person who could give him one wasn't there. He needed to confront Vanessa, and he needed to do it now. Thomas paced the living room, his mind racing, his hands shaking. His entire world had just shattered. 20 years. 20 years of love, trust, and devotion, built on a lie. He had never felt so betrayed, so humiliated. A storm brewed inside him, an uncontrollable mix of rage and disbelief. How could Vanessa have hidden this from him? How could she have deceived him for 2 decades? His marriage, his entire life, felt like a cruel joke. His fingers brushed against the documents in his hand once more. Vincent Carter. The name taunted him. Vanessa, no, Vincent, had spent years pretending to be someone else. The sound of the front door unlocking snapped him out of his daze. Vanessa stepped inside, grocery bags in hand. She smiled at him as if nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't spent 20 years lying to his face. "Hey, honey," she said, placing the bags on the kitchen counter. "You're home early." Thomas didn't respond. His grip on the papers tightened. Vanessa noticed the look on his face and her smile faltered. "Thomas." Silence. Then, without a word, Thomas threw the documents onto the counter. The papers scattered in front of her, exposing every secret she had buried. Vanessa froze. Her eyes darted to the birth certificate, the medical records, the name change form. Her face went pale. Thomas's voice was eerily calm, but the fury underneath was unmistakable. "Who the hell are you?" Vanessa swallowed hard. "Thomas, please. Don't you dare try to explain this away," he snapped, his voice rising. 20 years, Vanessa. 20 damn years. You let me believe." He choked on his words, shaking his head in disbelief. "You let me believe you were someone else." Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. "I didn't want to lie to you. You did lie to me." Thomas slammed his fist against the counter, making her jump. "You made me marry you under false pretenses. You made me love you, live with you." He exhaled sharply, his hands running through his hair. "My God, Vanessa. Or should I say Vincent?" Vanessa's lip trembled. "I was afraid, Thomas. I was afraid you wouldn't love me if you knew the truth." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "Damn right. I wouldn't have." He took a step closer, towering over her. "You stole 20 years from me. 20. Do you have any idea what that means? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Vanessa sobbed, shaking her head. "I never wanted to hurt you. I loved you. You don't do this to someone you love." A deadly silence filled the air. Vanessa's breathing was shaky, her entire body trembling. "Please, Thomas. We can talk about this." Thomas took a step back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His vision was blurred by rage, his thoughts clouded by betrayal. He wasn't thinking clearly. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the echo of 20 years of lies. His eyes flickered to the drawer, the same drawer where he kept his handgun. His mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, to take a breath, but he couldn't. The anger, the humiliation, the feeling of being made a fool for 2 decades. It was too much. Vanessa must have noticed the shift in his expression because her face paled even more. "Thomas," she whispered, but it was too late. He reached into the drawer and pulled out the gun. Vanessa's breath hitched as her eyes locked onto the gun in Thomas's trembling hands. A cold sweat broke across her skin. This wasn't the man she knew. The man standing before her wasn't her loving husband of 20 years. This was someone else. Someone consumed by fury, betrayal, and unrelenting hatred. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "Please, don't do this." But Thomas wasn't listening. His chest rose and fell erratically, his grip tightening around the handle of the gun. His world had crumbled in an instant, and in its place was a swirling storm of humiliation and rage. The woman, the man, he had trusted with his life had shattered everything he believed in. "You lied to me," he growled, his voice shaking with emotion. His finger hovered over the trigger. "You stole my life, my marriage, everything." Vanessa took a cautious step backward, her hands raised in surrender. Tears streamed down her face as she searched for any glimmer of the man she had loved for 20 years. "I was scared, Thomas. I loved you. I still love you." "Shut up," he roared, stepping forward. His mind was screaming. "She tricked you. She used you. She made you a fool." Vanessa's back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to run. "Please," she sobbed, shaking her head. "I'm still me. I'm still the woman you fell in love with." Bang! The first shot rang out like a thunderclap, the bullet tearing through Vanessa's shoulder. She gasped, staggering against the wall as searing pain shot through her body. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. Thomas stood over her, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking violently, his vision blurred with rage and betrayal. He had spent 20 years living a lie. He had loved a ghost. Bang! 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 3 more shots exploded in rapid succession, each bullet ripping into her chest. Blood pooled beneath her as she gasped for air, her wide, tear-filled eyes pleading for mercy. Thomas didn't stop. He aimed one last time. Bang! The final bullet struck Vanessa in the head, silencing her forever. For a moment, the room was eerily still. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. The only sound was the distant ringing in Thomas's ears and the shallow, ragged breaths escaping his lips. Vanessa, Vincent, lay motionless on the floor, her once beautiful face now lifeless. Blood seeped across the tiled floor, staining the anniversary flowers she had bought earlier that day. Thomas's hands trembled as he lowered the gun, staring at what he had done. He had loved her. He had killed her. And now there was no turning back. The gun felt heavy in Thomas's trembling hands. His ears rang from the 5 deafening shots, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. Vanessa's, Vincent's, lifeless body lay sprawled on the cold tile floor, her wide, unseeing eyes frozen in shock. Thomas staggered backward, his breath ragged. His mind raced, trying to grasp what he had just done. The woman he had spent 20 years with, the woman he had kissed, held, and built a life with, was now nothing more than a motionless corpse before him. His pulse pounded in his ears. What have I done? He looked down at his hands. They were shaking, coated with flecks of blood. His knees buckled, and he stumbled, gripping the counter for support. The rage that had consumed him moments ago had vanished, replaced by a cold, creeping horror. His eyes darted around the room as reality set in. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't some twisted dream. He had killed his wife. No, he had killed a stranger. A part of him still refused to accept it. Vanessa had been his everything, his rock, his partner. Could 20 years of love really be erased in a single moment of betrayal? But the evidence was there. The birth certificate, the name change papers, the medical records. The truth had been staring him in the face, buried in the past. And now Vanessa, Vincent, was dead. A sickening silence filled the house. It was almost unbearable. Then came the panic. Thomas's hands shot to his head, gripping his hair. What do I do? He couldn't take it back. He couldn't undo the 5 shots that had ended the life of the person he had once adored. His mind scrambled for solutions. Call the police? No. He would be arrested immediately. He had no defense, only raw, unforgiving emotion. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Run? His eyes flickered toward the front door. He could disappear, leave town, start over. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't work. The police would find him. His gaze fell on the phone sitting on the counter. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no way out. Either he turned himself in, or he ended it all. His fingers twitched toward the gun once more. 1 bullet left. 1 way to escape the consequences. Thomas closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night. Thomas froze. The distant wail of sirens cut through the thick silence of the house, growing louder with every passing second. His breath hitched. Who called the police? His mind raced. Had a neighbor heard the gunshots? Had Vanessa, Vincent, somehow managed to call for help before she died? The blaring sirens sent a cold wave of panic through his body. He looked around the blood-splattered kitchen, the lifeless body at his feet, the gun still clutched in his trembling hands. There was no time. He had to make a decision. His first instinct was to run. He took a step toward the back door, but then reality hit him like a truck. Where would he go? He had no plan, no escape route. The police would catch him within hours. His next thought was to stage the scene. Maybe he could make it look like a break-in or self-defense. But how? There was no forced entry, no struggle. Only a man who had just murdered his wife in cold blood. His breathing became shallow, his chest tight. No way out. The sirens were right outside now. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, casting eerie colors across the crime scene. The sound of screeching tires and slamming car doors filled the air. This was it. A commanding voice boomed from outside. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up." Thomas's entire body stiffened. His grip on the gun tightened. Do I go out? Do I pull the trigger? Do I fight? He turned toward the front door, his legs like lead. He had seconds to decide. Then bang, bang, bang. A heavy fist pounded against the door. "Thomas Carter, we know you're in there. Open the door now." His time had run out. Thomas took one last look at the love of his life, the lie of his life. Then, with a deep breath, he made his choice. Thomas's hands trembled as he stood in the blood-stained kitchen, staring at the front door. The pounding continued, each knock hammering against his chest like a death sentence. "Thomas Carter, open the door." His mind raced. What do I do? He turned to the gun in his hand, his fingers slick with sweat against the cold steel. One bullet left, one way out. He could put an end to this before the cops ever laid hands on him. He could escape the shame, the prison cell, the trial that would expose his humiliation to the world. His eyes darted to Vincent's, lifeless body. Blood had spread in a dark pool around her. The woman he had once adored, the person he had trusted with his life, had been nothing but a mirage. Was it really love? Or had he been in love with a ghost? More pounding. More voices. Last warning. Open the door or we're coming in. Thomas inhaled sharply. His choices were laid out before him. He could end it, put the gun to his temple, pull the trigger, and let the police find two bodies instead of one. No trial, no questions, no shame. Or, he could face it, open the door, drop the gun, and let them take him. Endure the endless interrogations, the trial, the headlines. The world would know what happened. They would all know. His heart pounded. The door shook as officers prepared to break it down. One choice. Thomas's breathing slowed. His fingers uncurled from the gun. He took a step toward the door. Then another. With shaking hands, he reached for the doorknob and turned it. The moment Thomas turned the knob, the door burst open, nearly knocking him off balance. Blinding white lights flooded the dimly lit house, and a chorus of voices roared at him. "Drop the weapon. Hands up. Now." The sheer force of the command sent a shiver down his spine. His knees wobbled as he slowly raised his hands, the gun slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. Instantly, multiple officers swarmed inside, their guns trained on him. A knee slammed into his back as rough hands forced him onto the cold floor, pressing his face against the hard wood. "Suspect in custody," an officer called out. Thomas barely registered the feel of cold steel as handcuffs snapped around his wrists. His head spun, his ears ringing, his chest heaving. The world around him blurred. The flashing red and blue lights, the distant murmurs of officers assessing the crime scene, the hushed whispers of curious neighbors gathering outside. Then he heard the words that sealed his fate. "We've got a female victim, multiple gunshot wounds. No signs of life." Another voice. "Wait. The ID doesn't match. This name is Vincent Delacroix." Silence fell over the room. The lead officer, a grizzled man with a hardened expression, looked down at Thomas. "You want to tell me why your wife's legal documents say she was born a man?" Thomas clenched his jaw. A lump formed in his throat. He couldn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because the truth was too painful to say aloud. His world had collapsed in an instant. His marriage had been a lie. His love had been a deception. And now Vincent was dead at his hands. The officer shook his head, motioning for the others. "Get him up. He's coming with us." Two officers hauled Thomas to his feet. His legs felt weak, his body numb. As they dragged him toward the waiting squad car, he caught a glimpse of Vanessa's motionless form being covered with a white sheet. His breath hitched. 20 years of love, gone in 5 bullets. The cameras were already flashing as he was shoved into the backseat of the police car. The reporters would tear him apart. The world would brand him as a monster, a murderer, a man who snapped after discovering the unthinkable. And in that moment, as the car doors slammed shut and the engine roared to life, Thomas realized he would never be free again. Inside the cold, gray interrogation room, Thomas sat motionless, his hands cuffed to the metal table. The weight of his actions pressed on him like a crushing force. Across from him, Detective Harris leaned forward, fingers laced together. "Tell me why you did it." Thomas stared at the table, silent. Harris sighed. "Your wife, Vincent, was murdered in cold blood. 5 shots. That's not an accident. That's rage." Thomas clenched his fists. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. You loved her, didn't you?" Harris pressed. Thomas's eyes burned. Finally, he whispered, "I didn't know who I was loving." Harris exchanged a glance with his partner, then leaned back. "That's all I needed to hear." The door clicked open. 2 officers entered. "Thomas Carter, you're under arrest for murder." The courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed. Whispers filled the air. The prosecution painted Thomas as a man consumed by rage and humiliation. The defense argued temporary insanity, a man whose entire life had been a lie. But nothing could change the facts. 5 shots, no hesitation, a clear intent to kill. When the verdict came, Thomas sat frozen. Guilty of second-degree murder. Thomas stood before the judge, his heart pounding. "You took a life out of anger and betrayal. That does not excuse your actions," the judge said. "You are sentenced to 25 years to life in prison." The gavel slammed down. It was over. Prison was hell. Thomas kept to himself, lost in his own thoughts. Every night, he replayed the moment he pulled the trigger. The betrayal, the rage, the regret. He had thought killing Vincent would set him free. But the real prison was inside his own mind. Years passed. Thomas sat on his cot, staring at the cracked ceiling. He had spent 20 years loving a lie, and now he would spend the rest of his life paying for the truth.